Friends, colleagues, Steve Chalke is in the building.
Oh, yeah.
We thought it was never going to happen.
Yeah, I did.
So thank you very much for bearing with us and for, tolerating our having to flip round of the talk and the drinks reception. Hopefully the drinks kept you going while you were waiting. I'm Professor Esther McIntosh, and I am the Director of the Centre for Religion and Society and the Chair of the Ebor Committee. The Ebor Lectures in Theology and Public Life were established in 2006 in York to promote conversation across the diversity of religious beliefs and issues of public concern. We now meet twice a year. The Ebor Lectures are an ecumenical project jointly sponsored and organised by the York Minster, the Methodist Church, the Morel Trust, the Quakers and York St John University. And for today's Ebor Lecture, I am delighted to welcome Reverend Canon Steve Chalke. I'll keep the introductions brief, but give Steve a chance to catch his breath. So Steve Chalke, as I'm sure many of you all know, is a social activist working for vulnerable children, LGBT and BAME rights, and against poverty, homelessness and human trafficking. He's the founder of the Oasis Charitable Trust and Stop the Traffic. He was a special advisor on community action to the United Nations Global Initiative to fight human trafficking. Steve's also a Baptist minister and an ecumenical canon of Southwark Cathedral, and received an MBE in 2004, an honorary doctorate in 2015, and was chosen as an Olympic torchbearer in the 2012 Olympics and awarded the Spirit of London Marathon Award in 2018. Steve is a keen runner and Guinness World Record holder for funds raised for charity, running the London Marathon on repeated occasions. He's authored more than 40 books, attracting both praise and controversy amongst evangelical Christians, and is a regular broadcaster and contributor across the media. Steve co-authored an open letter in response to the co-opting of Christian symbolism at the Unite the Kingdom rally in London a few weeks ago. The letter was signed by many church leaders across denominations and published in the Times and the Mirror. And the title of Steve's talk tonight is A Manifesto for Hope, Creating Opportunities for Children, Young People and Their Families. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you. Thank you very much. Cool. And I'm still sweating from running from the station to get here. Thank you for waiting. I'll refer to this perhaps later. But the reason I'm so late is because the train down from York to London, which was going to be my train up from London to York, it stopped because someone jumped in front of it. It's the third long distance journey I've made by train in a row, which has been delayed by hours because of what they call a jumper. Somebody who had no hope, nothing to live for, but threw themselves under a train. That's a sobering thought, isn't it? The slide behind me is of an acorn. Every acorn has the potential to become a mighty oak tree, every acorn. But whether or not it fulfills its destiny, becomes what it could be, depends on the soil into which it falls. If it falls onto hard concrete road, it stands no chance. It's likely to be crushed or eaten. But if it falls into deep, rich, nutritious, well-irrigated soil, it can grow to be what it was always destined to be. But it's not just that it needs that soil as a seed. As it breaks ground and becomes a sapling, what it needs is still protection from trees around it, from us as human beings. Because otherwise, it gets overwhelmed by the cold, the snow, or the wind. It gets trampled on, it gets broken. But if it's protected through its infancy, through its early years, that tree can go on to become what it was always destined to be. And that's the truth for every human being. And for every casualty who throws themselves in front of a train, making the choice to end their own life. Not to commit a crime, actually. The term suicide is like homicide, isn't it? dates back to when we thought these things were crimes. But now we know they are a lack of all hope. When all hope has vanished from your life and there's nothing more you can do to give it up. That says something, doesn't it, about society and about the protection of that acorn to grow into stability. This morning, the government launched their curriculum review, and that's full of all sorts of things. I don't know what you think of it, those who have read it. I've been asked to commentate on it several times through last night and through today. But the truth is, what we owe to every child and every adult is that soil that nurtures and nourishes them. For a human being, of course, that soil is really love, community, belonging, relationship. We as humans have been on the planet at least 200,000 years. You used to be able to say that with certainty. Now it's up for grabs. Some people say 300,000 years, and just recently, a couple of weeks ago, some Chinese scholars say, no, it's probably at least 1 million years. Who knows? But what we do know is this, and what modern science tells us this, and much of my work is to do with neuroscience, working with young people who are at risk, who are in trouble, who haven't been sown into that rich soil, who've been denied love. What we do know is that our brains are adapted for community. Human beings are the most community-orientated animals on the planet. If you're a fish, parenting is short. You lay some eggs in most cases. There are one or two cases that break the rules. If you're a turtle, a female turtle, you crawl up onto a beach and lay 6 to a dozen eggs in a shallow dugout sandy hole, and then you cover it up with your flippers and you make it back to the sea, and that's the end of parenting. You've done your job. From the moment that young turtle is hatched, if it ever gets hatched, if it's not stolen or eaten by some seagull, etc., from the moment it's hatched, it's on its own. It's got to make its way back to the sea. You know, turtles are born at full moon. Did you know that? Around full moon? They're always born at full moon, freshwater turtles and sea turtles, because they're guided by the reflection of the moon on the water. That tells them which way to go. But we have erected roadways and bars and restaurants along every beach we can possibly find, and the lights are brighter and they crawl the wrong way. And perhaps you know someone who's gone on a holiday just to put turtles back in the sea. Do you know anybody who's done that? Well, you should look it up tonight. You can spend your next holiday in India or Africa or wherever, African country, and simply people pay huge amounts of money to lift young turtles as they hatch. You do this in Cyprus, you do it in Greece. Lift young turtles and just carry them to the water instead of them being distracted by the lights. That, of course, some of you will know, is called alloparenting, other parenting. And human beings do this. You know, if you're a young elephant, your mother will stick with you, they say, for up to 6 years. A lioness might stick with her cubs for 1.5 years, 2 years. But no tired old lion, male lion, leader of the pride, who's been dethroned, ever goes back to his grandmother to cry on her shoulder, back to his sister to just sit and feel like he belongs. We are the only species on earth that does that. We have lifelong relationships. We are community. We need, as John Donne said, the famous Dean of St. Paul's and poet, theologian, Trinitarian theologian, no man, no woman, none of us is an island. We belong to each other. We have need of each other. We're part of the continent. There's that strange part of life, isn't there, where we kind of figure that we can stand on our own. But in our beginnings, we are an active community. As we grow, we are dependent. And in our endings and our later years, we sober up and we realize that what matters most isn't the status or the car or the house or the job or the salary. I'm not saying that money doesn't matter. But what I am saying is that those of us who are privileged enough to have enough of those things come to the realization that none of those things really actually matter. And what matters most are the simple things. The togetherness, the family meal, the meal with a friend, the drink with a friend, the spending a day walking out with people that you love. Because we are actually community animals. This isn't just some kind of theory that I have. This is the latest science. Since the invention of the MRI scanner, of course, we can look inside the human brain for the first time in history. All brain science up until just about the turn of the millennium, just before in the late 90s, all brain science relied on one thing. It was people like you leaving your brains to science after you'd snuffed it. And then what happens is our brains get sliced up and people would look at the human. Throughout human history, that's been the way that we've done it. But in these last 30 years or so, we've been able to look inside a brain as it grows. Huge amount of research has been done around the growth of children into adolescence. And we're beginning to understand beyond adolescence now, brain growth. We know why boys in their teenage years aren't as mature as girls in their teenage years, because their prefrontal cortex doesn't develop and mature as fast. We know why young men take stupid decisions about driving at 100 miles an hour down a road in a car a day after passing their driving license. We know why. We know why. Because in a teenage brain, the accelerator is much more important than the brakes. You know, there's few brakes and loads of acceleration. That's why it's said that teenagers sneak out of bed to go to parties, whereas older people sneak out of parties to go to bed. It's just to do with the stage of life and the development of your brain and who we are and our understanding. But healthy development comes about through relationship. We know that. Human beings have lived in small communities for the 200,000 or so years that we've been on Earth. Homo sapiens have always been brought up in community, never by a single mum and dad, let alone a single parent, always in a multi-generational community. That's who we are. Our brains have developed for community, which is why we struggle when we don't have it. Now, this is very ecumenical, as Esther said. So let me tell you about the creation story according to Hesiod, according to the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. Everybody has creation stories. We've got two at the beginning of Genesis. I'm a Christian. We've got Genesis chapter 1 and then Genesis chapter 2, 3, and 4. You know, the story about Adam and Eve and the talking snake and the tree. You know, they are different stories. By the way, if you are a Christian, sometimes people say to me, are you saying the Bible's got no contradictions in it? And I say, well, have you ever read Genesis chapter 1 and then tried Genesis chapter 2 afterwards and not spotted all the contradictions? The different order of creation, for instance, because they're two different stories edited together. We don't know when, do we? Anyway, both of those creation stories, they're myths. They're not pieces of history, they're myths. If they're pieces of history, they become absolutely nonsensical. But if they are myths, which means parable, means story that's precious, they're far more important than historical narrative because they're teaching great truth. One of the, perhaps the preeminent story of creation in Greek mythology comes from Hesiod to start with, who was hanging around at the same kind of time as Homer, about 8 centuries before Jesus. And Hesiod, in one of his epic plays, it's called Works and Days, he tells a story that you'll know well, but it's the story of the creation of women. Men were already on Earth. In Greek mythology, men hung around with gods, you know, they battled and they didn't get on very well, and then they fell out and then they made it up and all this kind of stuff. But one of Zeus One of Zeus's friends, Prometheus, had given fire to human men, and Zeus was really hacked off about it. You can read about, you'll recognize this story in a minute. Zeus was really cheesed off. He was hacked off because he thought it made men too powerful. So he called together his brothers and sisters, and he decided something had to be done to limit the power of men. And he came up with a brilliant idea, and he said to one of his sisters, I want you to create, look, we are male gods and female gods, but they're all male on earth, our slaves. I want you to create the first woman. And she has to be beautiful, but she has to do my will. And so Pandora was created. Pandora's box. Yeah, you know the story. And Pandora is sent to Earth, to the king of the Greeks, to seduce him with her beauty and then spoil his life and the lives of all men on Earth. And she does that because Zeus gives her a box. Actually, it's a jar, but it comes, it's been mistranslated, and we all talk about Pandora's box. And you know what a Pandora's box is, don't you? It's a box full of trouble, loads of, twisted trouble, complex trouble. So Pandora arrives on Earth, and there she is with the king of the Greeks. And Zeus shouts, open the box! And she opens the box, and out of the box come the gifts. She's just ingratiated herself to the king. Out of the box, as she's ordered to open it, fly all of the gifts that Zeus has given to the people of Earth. Pain, pestilence, want, famine, poverty, disease, war, death. And then Zeus cries, shut the box! And she shuts the box. And Hesiod, this story's been retold and retold and retold, and it comes in different versions. But Hesiod tells us that one of the gifts was shut in the box. And the box, the gift that was shut in the box, was hope. And Hesiod makes the comment, and everyone down through history to Nietzsche and beyond have commented on this and discussed it and written books about this. Humanity can live with pain and pestilence and want and famine and disease and struggle and even death. But what humanity cannot do without is hope. Hope is shut in the box. Now, because I'm a Christian, of course, I know this. I didn't learn this when I at church, but behind the New Testament, behind Paul, who of course was born in Tarsus and grew up there, which is was a Greek. He's a Jew, but he's living in this Greek city, and it's a university city, just like York. But it's not a university of science or of maths. It's a university that was world famous for philosophy. So Paul understands Hesiod and Greek mythology. And he understands Aristotle. We haven't got time to get into that. But I'll tell you this, behind the New Testament sit Hesiod and Aristotle. And it's almost impossible to truly understand what Paul, for instance, is talking about in context without understanding the references he's making and the culture he lives in. One of the great things he is saying is this: hope has got out of the box. Hope was locked in the box, but hope is now out of the box. It was in December the 1st, 1942, that an academic turned politician in his mid-60s took a stroll up Downing Street to number 10, which you could do then without threat of being shot and all the rest of it. Even I can remember when you could do that. He strolled up number 10 and he knocked on the door and he posted a report that he'd been asked to do by Winston Churchill. the Prime Minister, the War Prime Minister, middle of the Second World War. It was 300 pages long. He worked on it for months and months. He handed it in. That government report became famous because his name was William Beveridge, and it became known as the Beveridge Report. And it's because of the Beveridge Report that we have the welfare state, state pensions, etc., 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 etc. The welfare state. But the crowning bit of all of this was his idea about a national health service. And it was after the war that Clement Attlee became the Prime Minister, a Labour leader, and it was Attlee's government that put in place the beginnings of the welfare state, and on July the 5th, 1948, the NHS, the National Health Service, the National Health Service was born. But there's an important distinction. Beveridge didn't talk about the National Health Service. He said, we need a National Health Service as part of our welfare. But it was christened the National Health Service in 1946, 2 years before the NHS was born. Beveridge strolled back up Downing Street and delivered another report, which no one ever talks about, but if you search hard on Google, you'll find it. And in that report, he said simply this. He's saying it, he's delivering it to the Prime Minister. He's saying, these are my words, not his. I'll give you some of his words. He's saying, you know that first report I gave you 4 years ago? Well, it'll never work. It's going to flop. It's going to fail. You can't do this. It will fall over. Your NHS will not work. Your welfare state will crumble. All my words. But that's his intent. That's what he's saying. A direct quote from him is he says this, that when he found out, because this is what he thought was wrong with it, when he found out that the welfare state was going to be delivered entirely by professionals and the NHS entirely by professionals, his quote is, it did make my heart faint. And the report that he handed in 46 simply said this, it was always meant to be about partnership. We're community animals. We need community. It's supposed to be about partnership between professional bodies and local communities. You have to empower local communities. They have to do this themselves. If you take away from them, if you disempower them, you don't give people agency. They become recipients, and recipients are passive. It has to be about community. It has to be about community. In 2010, early 2010, someone called Michael Marmot, have some of you read the Marmot report, or at least heard of it? Marmot, if you've not read it, or well, don't read it, it's long. Just read the executive summary. You can get it on Google, I'm sure. But Michael Marmot was asked by government to inquire into why we face so much poverty and hopelessness in our communities. Why so many children are growing up in poverty and failing to become the oak trees, my words, my metaphor, that they should be. And Marmot wrote this huge report, but summing it all up in a sentence. I know his cousin really well, so I've checked with her that this sums it up really well. He said, you have to empower communities, and the UK is the most centralised country in Europe. We take people from communities. We say, these are my words now, we say it takes a village to raise a child just before we pin it on the wall of the social services or whoever, and a pile of officers move in to sort a person's life out without really ever engaging with the people that live around that child, that know that child, that have invested in that child. And there's always someone who has. If the mum's not there or the dad's not there, there's an aunt, there's an uncle, there's a cousin, there's the next door neighbour, there's the friend. Empower local communities. Remember when David Cameron became the Prime Minister, which was in June, I think it was, 2010? Well, he came up with an idea called the Big Society. Do you remember that? And we were all going to work together. Do you remember that? Guess where he got that idea from? Michael Marmot, who brought his report out about 3 months before. It was some spin doctor's way of taking what Marmot had said and trying to make it work. But a year into the whole thing, a guy called Paul Twibby, who was appointed the CEO of the Big Society, resigned. And he was interviewed on Radio 4, the Today programme, in the morning. And he was asked by James Knockerty why he'd resigned. And he said, because we're the most centralised society in Europe. Everything's controlled at the centre. Power is taken away from people. It's not given to them. So this is a new moment. When I was 10, I realised that in the speed of all of this, I didn't look at my watch, my clock, but when I started, see, you'll have to wave ferociously when it's 5 minutes to go. When I was 10, I had a friend called John Dean, and I lived in South Norwood in South London, and we used to walk home from school. I was in the top year of the primary school, and as we walked through South Norwood Recreation Ground, which we always did, there's this little path. Some men, I guess, had concreted it over. You know, it was always a path, but they'd renewed the concrete. And because it was like, 4 o'clock or something, they'd gone home. And they just left a rope, and the rope with 2 bollards, and hanging from it said a sign that said, wet concrete. And there was a rope, about 20 yards further on. It said, wet concrete, do not cross. And John Dean, who was bolder than me, looked at me and he said, this is our moment. And before I knew it, he pulled me over this rope. He leapt over it and I kind of had to jump or just fall into the wet concrete. And then we ran through this semi-wet concrete. That's the point. It was semi-wet. We ran through to the other end and leapt over the other end. And off we went home. A few days later, I was walking through the park with my mum. There were our footprints, these footprints, John Dean's footprints and my footprints. And my mother looked at me, she said, these little rascals, what will they get up to next? Who brings these kids up? I didn't tell her it was her. I lived in South Norwood till I was 18, and whenever I walked through that park, there were my footprints. My point is this, the concrete is wet. We're at a moment in the development of our society when we have realised we cannot continue as we are. We have about a third of children who are persistently absent or occasionally absent or severely absent from our schools. They're just not there. We have a mental health crisis amongst young people and families. We have a rising tide of violence, gun violence, as well as knife violence. I began a charity 40 years ago, and we run at schools and community centres and youth groups in loads and loads of what people always call socio-economically deprived communities. But I prefer to think of them as underserved and under-listened to communities. Not heard, not listened to, not served. The communities we live in, we work in, a new community we're just beginning work in that I have just been introduced to in the last few weeks. I went to the community centre with a friend, and it was incredible to see elderly people in the community centre eating food that was out of date with mould on. That was last week. a community, a social housing estate, where no one wants to go out at night, where the kids don't want to go anywhere, and where there's nowhere for anyone to go. But not more than a quarter of a mile away, perhaps a third of a mile away, in a, you know how these communities change very quickly? There are 3 churches. 3 churches that on Sunday mornings stand up and sing about what it's like up there and, you know, the blessings that we have. But there is no connection. No connection at all. The concrete's wet, there is an opportunity. Here's a quote from Keir Starmer. Love him or hate him, but here's a quote from Keir Starmer. To fix, from just about 3 months ago. Keir Starmer. To fix the foundations of our country, we need a fundamental reset of the relationship between government and civil society. By that, he means churches, mosques, gurdwaras, community centres, local communities, grassroots organisations, people with passion. We need to reset the relationship between government and civil society. By harnessing the dynamism, innovation and trusted reach of civil society organisations, we can boast growth and deliver better outcomes for communities right across the country. But our task isn't to do that because a Prime Minister, because there have been several that have suggested that. Our task is also to agitate and say, so how does this work then? So how will we finally believe that it takes a village to raise a child? If you go back to that first creation story in Genesis, if you go back to the first creation story in Genesis, you'll see that in this poem, it's a poem really, as some of you will know, that creation story, it says in verse 27, and God created them. God said, let us create them in our image. Male and female, he created them. This is a revolutionary breakthrough. Again, if you understand the context of the culture at the time when this was first told as a story and written down, the idea was that only the king was ever in the image of God, or the representative of God. You can find out more about that by reading or going to the British Museum or somewhere. Only the king was in the image of God and was God's representative. Everybody else was just fodder. But in its 27th verse, the Hebrew Bible makes this magnificent statement that everyone is in God's image and is God's representative. We are in the image of God, the Creator. And God says, let us create them in our image. Doesn't go down very well with a lot of Christians, that, but it does say, let us create them in our image. People try to say, oh, that's an early reference to the Trinity. It is not. But there's something about God that is love, that is a community. In fact, when you think about it, how could God be love unless God is a community? You only are love when you have another to love and another to give yourself to. Let us create them in our image. All humanity is created in God's image. We are all God's representatives. And all humanity, therefore, are called to work in community and to work creatively. That's our task. That's what we're there for. Sometimes I am asked by Christian groups what my prayer would be for the poor in this country, or the kids that we work with, or the adults that we work with, whatever it is. What will my prayer be for them? And I always find that slightly cringy, to tell you the truth. And I remind people, perhaps this is little known, that the word amen doesn't mean, dear God, bless all those people in Gaza and all the poor people around here and sort it all out and give rights to everybody who doesn't have rights, for the marginalised, and create equality for women everywhere. Amen, that means over to you, abracadabra, we're going home for tea, but if you can sort this out by next Sunday, God, that would be very, rather wonderfully helpful to us. The word amen actually comes from an ancient root. It's a Hebrew word, amen. And it comes from an ancient root, which is sometimes translated as thought of as faithful, you know, trusting. But actually, if you do your homework, you'll see that the scholars say figuratively, amen can mean that. But practically, what it formally meant was a nurse. It meant somebody who nursed something. It's used in that way in the Old Testament, that amen, which is the ancient word from which the word amen, Hebrew word amen, comes. It means a foster father. It means a father who adopts something. It's used in that context, that word. So when I say amen, it's not like I'm signing off and going home to watch telly. It's I pray this prayer and we give ourselves to this. Together we will give ourselves to this. I know I'm supposed to stop. Can I show one more slide? Because I've only got 2 slides and I've only shown you one. So here's the other one. Ba-bam! A piece of rope. Okay, so here's this piece of rope. While I'm talking about Hebrew words, there's a Hebrew word for rope. And there are several Hebrew words for rope, but one of them is the Hebrew word tikva. And the root of tikva, which means rope, is also the Hebrew word, one of the Hebrew words that means hope. The Hebrew word, one of the Hebrew words for hope is tikva. It's also one of the Hebrew words for rope. You can find out more about that by reading the story of Jezebel, which is in Joshua chapter 2, for instance. You can find out more about how all that works. And why does the Hebrew word for hope also mean, in a different context, rope? And it's the same Hebrew word that gets used in 2 different contexts. Because hope isn't a kind of, you know, like Doreen's song, you know, things can only get better. Do you know that song? Yeah? Right? Well, we all know that things can get a whole lot worse. They don't have to get better. In fact, very often they don't get any better, especially for many people who live in our society. The gap between the rich and poor gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger all of the time, for instance. So things don't have to get better. You know, hope is chin up, you know, be better tomorrow, look on the bright side. That's an emptiness. But the biblical word for hope, the ancient Hebrew word for hope, also means multi-stranded woven cord or line. A multi-stranded woven cord. Because when you're down a deep hole, what you don't need is a best friend saying, chin up, you know, things will get better, see you tomorrow. Look on the bright side. What you actually need is someone, a group of people, to construct a multi-stranded rope and pass one end of it down to you that you can cling to and hold on to the other end and pull you up. What I'm telling you this, as I explain the meaning of amen, and I explain the meaning of tikva, rope, hope, is that the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish Bible that the Christians nicked and then changed the name of and called the Old Testament, but the Hebrew Bible is all about concrete action. Concrete action. To close, a quote from a bishop, Augustine, black African 4th century bishop from modern day Algeria. Augustine said this. He said, hope has 2 beautiful daughters. 2 beautiful daughters. The first is called anger. Anger at the way things are. But the second is called courage. The courage to see that they do not remain that way. Let's weave a multi-stranded rope together, which is the opportunity of every faith community in York and beyond. Let's work together for this multi-stranded rope that lifts people out of their poverties and brings them true hope. As we do that, we can really say amen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, and I'm sure there'll be questions for you, perhaps practical questions about how we respond to the flags around York and other issues, or maybe some people here from education with practical questions about the work you're doing in education and your different approach to schooling compared to the government standard approach. So yeah, we do now have about 10 minutes for questions, so over to you.
You'll need to shout loud, I think. Oh, there's a mic.
They'll bring a microphone.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was inspiring. Can I be cheeky and push you on the politics a little bit? So you quoted from Keir Starmer. What is your reaction to the New York mayoral election and how that reflects on Jack Polanski, for example, who runs on that message of hope? Do you think it's to do, could it fit a kind of socialist model politically? Is that where your politics lie? If I can be cheeky and ask that.
Yeah, no, of course you can. So, I, over the 40 years of Oasis, I founded Oasis 40 years ago. Labour came into power, and very fortunately, I had the opportunity to get to know Tony Blair. We were running, Oasis was already running schools in Indian slums. I'm 50% Indian. That's why Oasis was working there. And I had an opportunity one day, because I was taking a funeral that he came to tell him about, he wasn't Prime Minister, by the way, he was a Labour MP then, and to tell him about the schools we ran in India. And because he was an MP, he gave me his number, and you know, we stayed in touch a bit, and then lo and behold, he became the Prime Minister. So I rang him up and said, can we run one of those new schools you're going to build in the UK? Academies, which were then only going to be 40, working in poor areas to create leadership. That's what it was. And so I worked alongside the Labour government, but I remember one day when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, he asked me to go and speak at Number 10 about the role of the church and the role of faith. And I remember what I said. I said, look, you know, they were all gathered there, lots of people, and Gordon Brown spoke, and then it was my job to respond. And I said, Gordon, I know we're in your house, it was Number 10, and all these wonderful people with me are enjoying your wine and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the thing. Biblically, there was always a tension between the head of state and the prophet. And I'm not claiming to be a prophet, but it's the church's job and the role of faith groups more widely to be prophetic. So there needs to be friendship in our relationship, but tension in our relationship. John the Baptist knew Herod. Herod knew John the Baptist. You know, Saul knew Samuel. You can go on, can't you? But there needs to be tension in that relationship. Then the Tories came to power, and I worked with the Tories, and we developed primary schools and all sorts of other things that hadn't been possible before. But there was huge tension in some of those relationships. Now, again, we're working with Labour. The important thing is to work with local government, because it's locally that things need to change. It's always locally that things need to change. I would say one last thing about, I think the election in New York yesterday, last night, whatever it was, I think is really interesting, because it was a message of hope for those who were dispossessed, and they responded to it in huge numbers. I happen to know, by the way, you know, Donald Trump's hatred of Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London. I'm reliably informed, because we work a bit in America, and I know people across the political divide, that this was never about Sadiq Khan. It's about the mayor of New York, a Muslim. If you get a Muslim, you're going to get Sharia law. Do you know all of that? These Muslims don't know how to run cities. And that was what that political tension was about. But I think our job is not to hide away. I don't think that spirituality hides away. I think that spirituality is about getting engaged and getting involved, but keeping, to mix the metaphors, our North Star. So do I agree with everything Labour do? No, I don't. I can be specific about educational policies if you want, but it'll probably bore some of the rest of you. But are there good policies, and are there policies I wouldn't bring into action? Like, for instance, the reading test for kids at the end of year 8. I think that's a dreadful thing. It's yet another accountability thing that's going to, you know, if you want to do well, you're going to be the school that excludes kids from poor communities, because then you're going to get better results at the end of year 8, aren't you? But if you become inclusive and you care for people who are neurodiverse, care for people that have got developmental trauma, you're going to be caned by this new test. But I've already said that on radio. You know, I've already said that, because we have to be in the back. You've got to be in the fight, because perhaps we can turn turn that bit around. That's probably a rambly answer, but it's an active involvement. The last thing I'd say on this, the more you do, the more the guy with the skin in the game is the guy that gets listened to. And change never comes from the top, actually. If you take ideas that governments put into action, they come from people in the middle. They don't come from the bottom. I wish they did. But people right at the bottom feel disempowered, unheard, not listened to. And it's our job as faith groups to work with communities and empower them. And then you get a group, small groups in the middle. They've got enough power to speak truth into, as they see it, into things. Never being big-headed, you know, we could get it wrong, can't we? That's the point. But our job is to be involved, but we need to work together and use our buildings and our resources and our people to be outward-looking instead of inwardly navel-gazing.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
No one wants to ask anything.
Yeah, Joe, thank you.
Yeah, just with the comments you've just made, actually, I really echo your comments about the testing. As someone who was dyslexic and brought up in an educational environment where you're just constantly testing kids, it does no good at all. I just wondered if you could sort of, from listening to you talking, it seems like a major theme is that as a society, we seem to focus on the cost of everything and the value rather than the value of everything. And I just wondered what your thoughts were about how it seems like all the places that communities mix, i.e. churches, church attendances, record low, even things as simple as pubs closing down, community centres being closed in the early stages of the Conservative government. I just wondered how you kind of get around that and the difficulties you see moving forward with engaging with communities sort of directly, and communities engaging with each other, I think, is what I'm trying to get.
Yeah. When I went to school, I failed the 11 plus, and then I failed everything all the way through. And as a result, and even when I went to theological college, they never let me do a degree because they said that I wasn't bright enough to do the degree. So all the other people in my year did this degree, and I did a specially hatched diploma, you know, so there you go. And anyway, so the thing was, the school I went to, they said, you'll only ever work in a factory. They said it to us all, you know. And between going to theological college and leaving school, I went to work in a factory. It was in Kent, in Ashford, on a big estate, which is called Stanhope. And they used to call it Stanhope No Hope. And I went to live there for 2 years, but I worked in a factory as a labourer, and then I got some, you know, bed and board type of thing. And then in the evenings, I decided before I went, that I was going to set up a youth group. And I used the money that I got as a labourer between the ages of 18 and 20 to start this youth group and start what I always grandly called a theatre company. But it was actually a little drama group, you know, and we put on shows for the community and did all sorts of things. But I learned this great lesson there, which actually is a deep theological lesson. You know, it's incarnation. You know, to quote the New Testament, you know, John's Gospel, chapter 1, the prologue to John's Gospel says, the Word became flesh and we saw. We saw, not that we heard, we saw his beauty, his grace, truth. We saw. So it's about living amongst people. I've tried to do that all my life. And you know, I live in an area where we developed a church, and we developed a primary school and a secondary school and a community farm, and we work in the hospital in the emergency department. Do you know, in London, I don't know the stats for York, but in London, 200 children a week end up in an emergency department having tried to take their lives. So we work in several emergency departments in London and Manchester and various other places now. But when I went to be the minister of a church in Waterloo, and I went there in my spare time in 2003, Oasis already existed, and they only had 10 people in the congregation, so I did it in my spare time as a kind of hobby, you know, and there was, this building seated 400, but it had 10, and they were mostly elderly. Almost all of them have died now. I said, it can be different, it can be different, it can be different. In that community now, which is 22, 23 years on, we employ 250 people, guess, you know. We run education, we run a children's centre, a primary school, a secondary school, a sixth form centre, an advice centre, the local library, etc., lots of other things as well. But that was built by being with those 10 people, by learning their stories, by drinking tea with them, by remembering their birthdays, by celebrating their lives. And together, that disempowered group of people with this jalopy of a building that was falling down, because it was, that group of people grew and grew and grew. Because when you work with a small group on the ground, if you give yourself to them, all the difference can be made. One of the problems with government, and I'm not here to knock government, is the further the policy maker is from the ground, the more irrelevant the policy is likely to be. The social distance, as well as the geographical distance between the town hall or the county hall or, you know, Westminster Hall and the delivery on the ground, that is, you know, the greater the distance, the more irrelevant the policy. And so what we have to do is, as faith groups, be on the ground, not sit in buildings praying about stuff. Yeah. So this is something which is called Oasis Restore. Between 2010 and 2024, I worked with government from the time the Tories came in, you know, big society and all that. It was right at that time when I had a conversation with the Tory government about the lack of justice for young people, because we lock kids up who are poor. We don't lock up the rich. We lock kids up who have, you know, I always think the first socialization in life is your home. And in your home, if your parents or your parent is poor and they're struggling so much with their emotional centeredness, they don't have time for you. That's not because they don't love you, but they're doing 3 jobs, cleaning jobs, etc. They're coping with the lack of love they've received, and intergenerational trauma is intergenerational. So this mum was actually the child who was oppressed and forgotten and abused and neglected just 5 years ago. Do you see what I mean? So I said there is no justice. We ought to do something about this. And to cut a very long story short, I said what we do is we take these people and we imprison them, and the reoffending rate is almost 100% if you take it over more than a year. If you look at it in a year, which is what the officials do, the current reoffending rate for kids leaving a youth jail is 82.9%. i.e. 83%, and that's in the first year. And that's not a re-offending rate, it's the re-getting caught rate, the re-conviction rate. I mean, basically 100% of people re-offend because they're owned by gangs, they're controlled, they have nothing, do you know, etc., etc., all sorts of things. So we worked and got the law changed to allow a charity in this country for the first time to run a custodial centre therapeutically, instead of a penal system, instead of we're here to punish you. You've been punished by the state. They've taken away your freedom. We are here to bring restoration to you. And you do that therapeutically through love. Love has strong boundaries, of course, but it's love. The MOJ, Ministry of Justice, built for us this centre, Oasis Restore it's called, and you need a secure centre. It's secure. Every young person that comes to us has committed the most violent crimes, you know, murder, attempted murder, manslaughter, etc., etc. They've done that. But it's incredible how they respond to love, but love with boundaries. The problem was that we discovered that the Ministry of Justice had made a mistake, which they readily acknowledged. They thought they'd given us secure doors. They looked big and secure, but they were just they were heavy, they were just vinyl, and they were filled with chipboard. They were filled MDF, do you know? And one day a dysregulated kid who was going to go for a court case, he kicked one of the doors. Those of you involved in education will know that in a secondary school, doors get kicked, you know, just, you know, by a kid that's having a wobbler, you know, that is just losing it kind of thing. And that's called dysregulation technically, but we know what they're having a meltdown. So this kid has a meltdown and kicks the door, not to get through, it just kicks the door, and it broke. It didn't come open. Well, it did after it broke, but it just broke in two. And this sent shockwaves around the community because the other kids now realise that the door that they think they're safe behind, they're not safe behind. And our staff were intimidated. If you're going to create security, you need the environment to work for you, it to be a secure environment, and then you need to be well trained therapeutically and in terms of restraint when necessary, etc. But the doors all broke, and in the end we couldn't maintain safety because of that. In fact, as the doors broke, they split, and then you had shards, and then there was a story in the news about how all the kids had weapons. They didn't. They just picked up bits of wood and that were spiky. They handed them all in, but the way these things get reported is these are weapons, you know. So we came to the conclusion that we had to shut until new secure doors are fitted, and so we're still waiting for that to happen. But we have also, in fact, next week we're going to, hopefully, we're going to complete on buying a big vicarage, big old vicarage, because we need to do transition for these kids as well. That's another thing we found while we were open. Children that were leaving us because their sentence had ended, there was no hope for them because there was nothing provided for them except an interview with a yacht worker a couple of weeks later, a youth offending team worker. And so we're creating a huge house where young people can come and stay with us when their sentence is left. Because, you know, if you've got a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old, you don't say you're 16 or 18 now, see ya, goodbye. Remember, we're allo parents, we keep going. Yeah, so that's that story.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, and we hope to see that rolled out across the country. That sounds
it
fantastic.
Needs to be a model for everything else because we must work therapeutically. I could say all behaviours communication. If I'm angry, I'm not angry at you. I'm angry with myself. My wife always says to me, she's very sensible. She says, Steve, the more stressed you are, the more stupidly you behave. Now, I know that doesn't apply to you because you're totally calm the whole time. But I'm the kind of person, and the more stressed I am, I say silly things that I have to go apologising for. Does that make any sense, Esther? Yeah. Do you do it too? Yeah.
Ask my students.
All right. So that's the point. So what if you're a person, a child, an adolescent, you're an adult who lives their whole life, you know, hypervigilant because you're scared. You're always looking around because you've been abused, you've been raped, you've been abandoned, you've been looked past, you're scared always. It's not that the child goes from 0 to 100 and explodes, it's there are 95 all the time. And then something tips them over the edge. It's what stress does to us, it's what stress does to them.